Book 2, Part 6 of Herodotus Histories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Histories, Volume 1 by Herodotus of Halicarnassus, translated by A. D. Godley. Book 2, Part 6, paragraphs 116 to 133. This, the priests said, was how Helen came to Proteus. And in my opinion Homer knew this story too, but seeing that it was not so well suited to epic poetry as the tale of which he made use, he rejected it, showing that he knew it. This is apparent from the passage in the Iliad, and nowhere else does he return to the story, where he relates the wanderings of Alexander, and shows how he and Helen were carried off course, and wandered to, among other places, Sidon in Phoenicia. This is in the story of the prowess of Diomedes, where the verses run as follows: They were the robes all embroidered, the work of women of Sidon, whom godlike Alexandrus himself brought from Sidon, crossing the broad sea, the same voyage on which he brought back Helen of noble descent. He mentions it in the Odyssey also. The daughter of Zeus had such ingenious drugs, good ones, which she had from Thon's wife, Polydamna, an Egyptian, whose country's fertile plains bear the most drugs, many mixed for good, many for harm. And again Menelaus says to Telemachus, I was eager to return here, but the gods still held me in Egypt, since I had not sacrificed entire hecatombs to them. In these verses the poet shows that he knew of Alexander's wanderings to Egypt, for Syria borders on Egypt, and the Phoenicians, to whom Sidon belongs, dwell in Syria. These verses and this passage prove most clearly that the Cyprian poems are not the work of Homer, but of someone else, for the Cyprian poems relate that Alexandrus reached Ilion with Helen in 3 days from Sparta, having a fair wind and a smooth sea, but according to the Iliad he wandered from his course in bringing her. Enough, then, of Homer and the Cyprian poems. But when I asked the priests whether the Greek account of what happened at Troy were idle or not, they gave me the following answer, saying that they had inquired and knew from Menelaus himself. After the rape of Helen, a great force of Greeks came to the Trojan land on Menelaus's behalf. After disembarking and disposing their forces, they sent messengers to Ilion, one of whom was Menelaus himself. When these were let inside the city walls, they demanded the restitution of Helen and of the property which Alexandrus had stolen from Menelaus and carried off, and they demanded reparation for the wrongs. But the Trojans gave the same testimony then and later, sworn and unsworn, that they did not have Helen or the property claimed, but all of that was in Egypt, and they could not justly make reparation for what Proteus the Egyptian had. But the Greeks, thinking that the Trojans were mocking them, laid siege to the city until they took it. But there was no Helen there when they breached the wall, but they heard the same account as before. So, crediting the original testimony, they sent Menelaus himself to Proteus. Menelaus then went to Egypt and up the river to Memphis. There, relating the truth of the matter, he met with great hospitality and got back Helen, who had not been harmed, and also all his wealth besides. Yet, although getting this, Menelaus was guilty of injustice towards the Egyptians, for adverse weather detained him when he tried to sail away. After this continued for some time, he carried out something impious, taking 2 native children and sacrificing them. When it became known that he had done this, he fled with his ships straight to Libya, hated and hunted, and where he went from there the Egyptians could not say. The priests told me that they had learnt some of this by inquiry, but that they were sure of what had happened in their own country. The Egyptians' priests said this, and I myself believe their story about Helen. For I reason thus: had Helen been in Ilion, then with or without the will of Alexandrus, she would have been given back to the Greeks. For surely Priam was not so mad, or those nearest to him, as to consent to risk their own persons and their children and their city, so that Alexandrus might cohabit with Helen. Even if it were conceded that they were so inclined in the first days, yet when not only many of the Trojans were slain in fighting against the Greeks, but Priam himself lost to death 2 or 3 or even more of his sons in every battle, if the poets are to be believed, in this turn of events, had Helen been Priam's own wife, I cannot but think that he would have restored her to the Greeks, if by so doing he could escape from the evils besetting him. Alexandrus was not even heir to the throne, in which case matters might have been in his hands, since Priam was old; but Hector, who was an older and a better man than Alexandrus, was going to receive the royal power at Priam's death, and ought not to have acquiesced in his brother's wrongdoing, especially when that brother was the cause of great calamity to Hector himself and all the rest of the Trojans. But since they did not have Helen there to give back, and since the Greeks would not believe them, although they spoke the truth, I am convinced and declare the divine powers provided that the Trojans, perishing in utter destruction, should make this clear to all mankind, that retribution from the gods for terrible wrongdoing is also terrible. This is what I think, and I state it. The next to reign after Proteus, they said, was Rhampsinitus. The memorial of his name left by him was the western forecourt of the temple of Hephaestus. He set 2 statues here 41 feet high. The northernmost of these the Egyptians call Summer, and the southernmost Winter. The one that they call Summer they worship and treat well, but do the opposite to the statue called Winter. This king, they told me, had great wealth in silver, so great that none of the succeeding kings could surpass or come near it. To store his treasure safely he had a stone chamber built, one of its walls abutting on the outer side of his palace. But the builder of it shrewdly provided that one stone should be so placed as to be easily removed by 2 men, or even by one. So when the chamber was finished, the king stored his treasure in it, and as time went on, the builder, drawing near the end of his life, summoned his sons, he had 2, and told them how he had provided for them, that they have an ample livelihood, by the art with which he had built the king's treasure house. Explaining clearly to them how to remove the stone, he gave the coordinates of it, and told them that if they kept these in mind, they would be the custodians of the king's riches. So when he was dead, his sons got to work at once. Coming to the palace by night, they readily found and managed the stone in the building, and took away much of the treasure. When the king opened the building, he was amazed to see the containers lacking their treasure, yet he did not know whom to accuse, seeing that the seals were unbroken and the building shut fast. But when less treasure appeared the second and third times he opened the building, for the thieves did not stop plundering, he had traps made and placed around the containers in which his riches were stored. The thieves came just as before, and one of them crept in. When he came near the container, right away he was caught in the trap. When he saw the trouble he was in, he called to his brother right away, and explained to him the problem, and told him to come in quickly and cut off his head, lest he be seen and recognised, and destroy him too. He seemed to have spoken rightly to the other, who did as he was persuaded, and then, replacing the stone, went home, carrying his brother's head. When day came, the king went to the building, and was amazed to see in the trap the thief's body without a head, yet the building intact, with no way in or out. At a loss, he did as follows. He suspended the thief's body from the wall, and set guards over it, instructing them to seize and bring to him any whom they saw weeping or making lamentation. But the thief's mother, when the body had been hung up, was terribly stricken. She had words with her surviving son, and told him that he was somehow to think of some way to cut loose and bring her his brother's body, and if he did not obey, she threatened to go to the king and denounce him as having the treasure. So, when his mother bitterly reproached the surviving son, and for all that he said he could not dissuade her, he devised a plan. He harnessed asses, and put skins full of wine on the asses, then set out driving them, and when he was near those who were guarding the hanging body, he pulled at the feet of two or three of the skins, and loosed their fastenings, and as the wine ran out, he beat his head and cried aloud, like one who did not know to which ass he should turn first, while the guards, when they saw the wine flowing freely, ran out into the road with cups and caught what was pouring out, thinking themselves in luck. Feigning anger, the man cursed all, but as the guards addressed him peaceably, he pretended to be soothed and to relent in his anger, and finally drove his asses out of the road and put his harness in order. And after more words passed, and one joked with him and got him to laugh, he gave them one of the skins, and they lay down there just as they were, disposed to drink, and included him, and told him to stay and drink with them, and he consented and stayed. When they cheerily saluted him in their drinking, he gave them yet another of the skins, and the guards grew very drunk with the abundance of liquor, and lay down right there where they were drinking, overpowered by sleep. But he, when it was late at night, cut down the body of his brother, and shaved the right cheek of each of the guards for the indignity, and loading the body on his asses, drove home, fulfilling his mother's commands. When the king learnt that the body of the thief had been taken, he was beside himself, and, obsessed with finding out who it was who had managed this, did as follows. They say, but I do not believe it. He put his own daughter in a brothel, instructing her to accept all alike, and before having intercourse, to make each tell her the shrewdest and most impious thing he had done in his life. Whoever told her the story of the thief, she was to seize and not let go. The girl did as her father told her, and the thief, learning why she was doing this, did as follows, wanting to get the better of the king by craft. He cut the arm off a fresh corpse at the shoulder, and went to the king's daughter, carrying it under his cloak, and when asked the same question as the rest, he said that his most impious act had been when he had cut the head off his brother who was caught in a trap in the king's treasury, and his shrewdest, that after making the guards drunk he had cut down his brother's hanging body. When she heard this, the princess grabbed for him, but in the darkness the thief let her have the arm of the corpse, and clutching it she held on, believing that she had the arm of the other. But the thief, after giving it to her, was gone in a flash out of the door. When this also came to the king's ears, he was astonished at the man's ingenuity and daring, and in the end he sent a proclamation to every town, promising the thief immunity and a great reward if he would come into the king's presence. The thief trusted the king and came before him. Rhampsinitus was very admiring, and gave him his daughter to marry on the grounds that he was the cleverest of men. For, as the Egyptians, he said, surpassed all others in craft, so he surpassed the Egyptians. They said that later this king went down alive to what the Greeks call Hades, and there played dice with Demeter, and after winning some and losing some, came back with a gift from her of a golden hand-towel. From the descent of Rhampsinitus, when he came back, they said that the Egyptians celebrate a festival, which I know that they celebrate to this day, but whether this is why they celebrate, I cannot say. On the day of the festival the priests weave a cloth and bind it as a headband on the eyes of one of their number, whom they then lead, wearing the cloth, into a road that goes to the temple of Demeter. They themselves go back, but this priest, with his eyes bandaged, is guided, they say, by two wolves to Demeter's temple, a distance of 3 miles from the city, and led back again from the temple by the wolves to the same place. These Egyptian stories are for the benefit of whoever believes such tales, My rule in this history is that I record what is said by all as I have heard it. The Egyptians say that Demeter and Dionysus are the rulers of the lower world. The Egyptians were the first who maintained the following doctrine too, that the human soul is immortal, and at the death of the body enters into some other living thing, then coming to birth; and after passing through all creatures of land, sea, and air, it enters once more into a human body at birth, a cycle which it completes in 3000 years. There are Greeks who have used this doctrine, some earlier and some later, as if it were their own. I know their names, but do not record them. They said that Egypt, until the time of King Rhampsinitus, was altogether well governed and prospered greatly, but that Cheops, who was the next king, brought the people to utter misery. For first he closed all the temples, so that no one could sacrifice there, and next he compelled all the Egyptians to work for him. To some he assigned the task of dragging stones from the quarries in the Arabian mountains to the Nile, and after the stones were ferried across the river in boats, he organised others to receive and drag them to the mountains called Libyan. They worked in gangs of 100,000 men, each gang for 3 months. For 10 years the people wore themselves out building the road over which the stones were dragged, work which was in my opinion not much lighter at all than the building of the pyramid; for the road is nearly a mile long and 20 yards wide, and elevated at its highest to a height of 16 yards, and it is all of stone polished and carved with figures. The aforesaid 10 years went to the building of this road, and of the underground chambers in the hill where the pyramids stand. These the king meant to be burial places for himself, and surrounded them with water, bringing in a channel from the Nile. The pyramid itself was 20 years in the making. Its base is square, each side 800 feet long, and its height is the same. The whole is of stone polished and most exactly fitted. There is no block of less than 30 feet in length. This pyramid was made like stairs, which some call steps, and others tiers. When this its first form was completed, the workmen used short wooden logs as levers to raise the rest of the stones. They heaved up the blocks from the ground on to the first tier of steps. When the stone had been raised, it was set on another lever that stood on the first tier, and the lever again used to lift it from this tier to the next. It may be that there was a new lever on each tier of steps, or perhaps there was only one lever, quite portable, which they carried up to each tier in turn. I leave this uncertain, as both possibilities were mentioned. But this is certain, that the upper part of the pyramid was finished off first, then the next below it, and last of all the base and the lowest part. There are writings on the pyramid in Egyptian characters, indicating how much was spent on radishes and onions and garlic for the workmen, and I am sure that, when he read me the writing, the interpreter said that 1600 talents of silver had been paid. Now, if that is so, how much must have been spent on the iron with which they worked, and the workmen's food and clothing, considering that the time aforesaid was spent in building, while hewing and carrying the stone and digging out the underground parts was, as I suppose, a business of long duration. And so evil a man was Cheops that, needing money, he put his own daughter in a brothel, and made her charge a fee, how much they did not say. She did as her father told her, but was disposed to leave a memorial of her own, and asked of each coming to her that he give one stone. And of these stones they said the pyramid was built that stands midmost of the three, over against the great pyramid. Each side of it measures 150 feet. The Egyptians said that this Cheops reigned for 50 years. At his death he was succeeded by his brother Kephren, who was in all respects like Cheops. Kephren also built a pyramid, smaller than his brother's. I have measured it myself. It has no underground chambers, nor is it entered like the other by a canal from the Nile, but the river comes in through a built passage and encircles an island in which, they say, Cheops himself lies. This pyramid was built on the same scale as the other, except that it falls 40 feet short of it in height. It stands near the Great Pyramid. The lowest layer of it is of variegated Ethiopian stone. Both of them stand on the same ridge, which is about 100 feet high. Kephren, they said, reigned for 56 years. Thus they reckon that for 106 years Egypt was in great misery, and the temples so long shut were never opened. The people hate the memory of these two kings so much that they do not much wish to name them, and call the pyramids after the shepherd Philitis, who then pastured his flocks in this place. The next king of Egypt, they said, was Cheops's son, Mycerinus. Disliking his father's doings, he opened the temples and let the people, ground down to the depth of misery, go to their business and their sacrifices, and he was the most just judge amongst all the kings. This is why he is praised above all the rulers of Egypt, for not only were his judgments just, but Mycerinus would give any who were not satisfied with the judgment a present out of his own estate to compensate him for his loss. Though mild towards his people, and conducting himself as he did, yet he suffered calamities, the first of which was the death of his daughter, the only child of his household. Deeply grieved over this misfortune, he wanted to give her a burial somewhat more sumptuous than ordinary. He therefore made a hollow cow's image of gilded wood, and placed the body of his dead daughter therein. This cow was not buried in the earth, but was to be seen even in my time in the town of Sais, where it stood in a furnished room of the palace. Incense of all kinds is offered daily before it, and a lamp burns by it all through every night. Near this cow, in another chamber, statues of Mycerinus's concubines stand, so the priests of Sais said, and in fact there are about 20 colossal wooden figures there, made like naked women, but except what I was told, I cannot tell who these are. But some tell the following story about the cow and the statues: that Mycerinus conceived a passion for his own daughter, and then had intercourse with her against her will, and they say that afterwards the girl strangled herself for grief, and that he buried her in this cow, but that her mother cut off the hands of the attendants who had betrayed the daughter to her father, and that now their statues are in the same condition as the living women were. But this I believe to be a silly story, especially about the hands of the figures; for in fact we ourselves saw that the hands have fallen off through age, and were lying at their feet even in my day. As for the cow, it is covered with a purple robe, only the head and neck exposed, encrusted with a very thick layer of gold. Between the horns is the golden figure of the sun's orb. It does not stand, but kneels. It is as big as a live cow of great size. This image is carried out of the chamber once every year, whenever the Egyptians mourn the god, whose name I omit in speaking of these matters. Then the cow is brought out into the light, for they say that before she died she asked her father, Mycerinus, that she see the sun once a year. After what happened to his daughter, the following happened next to this king. An oracle came to him from the city of Buto, announcing that he had just 6 years to live, and was to die in the seventh. The king took this badly, and sent back to the oracle a message of reproach, blaming the god that his father and his uncle, though they had shut up the temples, and disregarded the gods, and destroyed men, had lived for a long time, but that he, who was pious, was going to die so soon. But a second oracle came, announcing that for this very reason his life was hastening to a close; he had done what was contrary to fate. Egypt should have been afflicted for 150 years, and the two kings before him knew this, but not he. Hearing this, Mycerinus knew that his doom was fixed. Therefore he had many lamps made, and would light these at nightfall, and drink and enjoy himself, not letting up day or night, roaming to the marsh country and the groves, and wherever he heard of the likeliest places of pleasure. This was his recourse, so that by turning night into day he might make his 6 years into 12, and so prove the oracle false. End of Book 2, Part 6.